Somebody's asking, how long will prejudice blind the visions of men? I come to say to you this afternoon, however difficult the moment,
yes, sir,
however frustrating the hour, it will not be long,
no,
because truth crushed earth will rise again.
Yes, sir.
How long? Not long.
Yes, sir.
Because no lie can live forever.
Yes, sir.
How long? Not long.
How long?
Because you shall reap what you sow.
Yes, sir.
The book is called Alabama's Civil Rights Trail, an illustrated guide to the Cradle of Freedom. And basically, it looks at the history of the civil rights movement in Alabama, kind of telling the story geographically. I wrote an earlier book, just kind of traditionally, history, telling it chronologically. And the kind of the theme of both books is that Alabama had a very central role in the civil rights movement, starting with the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955-56, on through the Freedom Rides, the Birmingham movement in 1963, and the Selma to Montgomery March in '65. But there are a lot of smaller stories scattered all around the state, including here in Mobile, and so I try to tell those as well. A lot of them were people I had never heard of, you know, and in many ways they were as ordinary as you know, as you or me, except they did these amazing things, you know, under such stressful situations that existed at the time. And so it seemed to me that it was a movement of foot soldiers as much as it was of great leaders. And so I wanted to track down as many of those people as I could who were still alive and talk to them about their stories while they still, you know, remembered the details of what happened, you know. And you can watch the old film footage and see the state troopers charging at demonstrators. But having somebody remember that as an 11-year-old girl, she thought they were monsters because they had these masks on their faces, you know. I don't know, I just love those kind of details as a, you know, as an old recovering journalist and storyteller at heart. It just makes the story kind of come alive and gives it a face, I think. In Mobile, for example, there's a little Jesuit college kind of on the western part of Mobile called Spring Hill College. Spring Hill College was the first school of any kind in the state of Alabama to desegregate. It began that process back in the 1940s, had its first African-American graduate in 1956, and that was very early in the Deep South to do that, and Spring Hill just kind of went ahead and did it quietly. And so in Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, he mentioned Spring Hill College as one of the places that offered hope and inspiration and tried to do the right thing, you know. So they're little, you know, I just want to call attention to the fact that in addition to those dramatic headlines where you saw police dogs and you saw the bombed church in Birmingham and those horrific scenes that were the flip side of the courage that the civil rights leaders and protesters were displaying, that you also had these quieter things going on in a number of other, you know, a number of different places. Mobile had a man, an African-American man whose name was John LaFleur. And Mr. LaFleur, back in the 1920s, decided that he was going to take on segregation and started one of the earliest NAACP chapters in the South here in Mobile, and kind of quietly went about the business of opposing lynchings and pursuing the right to vote, pursuing the desegregation of buses and public accommodations. And mostly he did it through negotiation and lawsuits and that kind of thing, less by demonstrations and confrontation. And he found a few moderate white allies in Mobile that would sort of meet him part way. And so that became kind of the Mobile story, although there was a lot beneath that apparent progress where there was still a lot of, you know, hardcore segregation and some pretty hard racial attitudes. And so it took a while for all that to play out, but there were people going way back in Mobile who tried to get things started, you know, earlier. John Hewlett became the first African-American sheriff in Lowndes County, Alabama. Lowndes County was arguably the toughest county in Alabama in terms of its resistance to civil rights. It was the county that the Selma to Montgomery March actually mostly took place in Lowndes County. Selma's in Dallas County, and then the next 50 miles of the march were through Lowndes County before you get to Montgomery in Montgomery County. And at the time that the march started through Lowndes County, in 1965, there were no African American voters in Lowndes County at all. 80% of the population was black, and there were no African Americans registered to vote. John Hewlett became one of the first two African American people in Lowndes County to register, and it was 1965 before that happened. There was violence in Lowndes County. Viola Luizzo, the Detroit housewife who came down for the march, was murdered in Lowndes County. A little bit after that, Jonathan Daniels, a white Episcopal priest who was supporting the movement in Lowndes County, was murdered in Lowndes County. So it was a rough place, and that was John Hewlett's home. And he became the most visible leader of the civil rights movement in Lowndes County, and actually was one of the founders of what became the Black Panther Party, which was an all-black political party designed to support black candidates for office. And he eventually won the office of sheriff in 1970 and served in that capacity off and on until he died. Very interesting man, brave man, you know. It was a rough, dangerous place, and he knew it. Very soft-spoken guy, about this tall, you know, physically as unimposing as a person can be, and yet he just had this boldness about him and this courage about him, and he went about the business of building a movement there. One of the interesting things about Alabama is that as tough as those years were in the state at the time, Alabama has probably done as good a job as any other state of kind of claiming that history officially and preserving it in civil rights sites and museums and markers. And the Alabama Department of Tourism works really hard at bringing people into Alabama to see the places where these dramatic things happened. Although the civil rights movement was a turbulent time, and it was hard, violent, ugly things happened during that time. But it was also a time when people confronted violence with nonviolence. And so there was something incredibly courageous about that. And because they did that, all of us became a little more free. You know, official segregation, legal segregation ended because of the civil rights movement. The Voting Rights Act that passed in 1965 essentially ushered in a period of interracial democracy in the South, in the Deep South, which it really hadn't existed in so many of these rural counties. There just weren't any black voters, or hardly any, you know. And so all of a sudden people could vote and could participate in their in the life of their own place, and so they were more free, and Alabama in that sense became the cradle of their freedom. But I think it became the cradle of other people's freedom too, my freedom, because, you know, it became easier just to be decent, you know, just to treat people like you maybe wanted to all along. And, you know, there was a time that if you were in Alabama, if you were publicly respectful toward an African American person, you could get both yourself and that person in trouble. I mean, it was that hard at times, and it isn't anymore, you know. And so I'm not saying racism is dead, it certainly is not, but it's no longer respectable, and you don't have to be afraid to be a person who treats people as human beings regardless of who they are.